All right. Good day, everybody. I hope everybody is well. This is another one from my $20 patron supporters. This is a film review, as you can see, of All Night and a Day. Very interesting film starring one Ashton Sanders that you can find on Netflix, at least as it is at the moment. So it came out on May 1st, from what I understand, and gives us an interesting kind of look at the life of some young black men around the country, but this is set in Oakland. Written and directed by Joe Robert Cole, co-writer of Black Panther. So let's see. Let me get the header up for you guys. You can see this is the poster that came out, right? Uh, and the subtitle is Born Gangster Repeat, right? Interesting kind of approach to it. All right, let me get some of this evened out here. Okay, that's not working the way I want it to. All right, so we'll leave it here for the moment. All right, so basically, this is an interesting film that chronicles the birth of a murderer, really. That's really what this film is about. It's a young brother. And obviously, we know in the patron section, there's going to be ample spoilers because this is, again, designed for you to talk to your sons about things that might pertain to life, right? To make films educational, but in a very personal way. So definitely, I encourage you to add family stories, lessons you want to pass on that complement your own values. I'm gonna give you about nine lessons that I use with my son in terms of talking about this film, but definitely feel free to replace them, add. But if nothing else, hopefully it'll get the juices flowing about how you want to use this film to, kind of teach. So this is a film that really chronicles the life or the advent and development of a murderer. Now, on the acting side of it, there's some very interesting characters that are in this film, and I'll showcase a few. Let me see if I can get them on the screen. So bear with me. Okay. So I don't think it's going to let me do that. So we'll do it this way. All right. So you have one Ashton Sanders. I have messed that up entirely. Here we go. All right. We're getting it. All right, I see what I'm doing now. All right, so it stars in one Ashton Sanders, and Ashton, you'll likely remember from a variety of other films. He was recently with Denzel Washington on one of his last joints. So we can actually go to his film page. He was known for Moonlight. He was in The Equalizer 2. He's been in a number of critical films lately. He's a good. I like him. He started. He was in. He played Bobby Diggs in Wu Tang and American Saga. He played Native Tongue. So I like him as an actor. He's a little on the quiet side, a little too much. So he needs to fill the silences a little more. But nonetheless, a good actor, and I think they chose an interesting brother for the role. One of my favorite actors actually was in this, and I didn't expect him to be, and that is one Jeffrey Wright. I really like Jeffrey Wright, and I've seen him in so many things. It's hard to narrow down everything I've liked him in, but I liked him in Ali with Will Smith. I liked him in, Shaft. I didn't even recognize his character. He's going to play in the upcoming Batman movie as James Gordon, which is a trip unto itself. I liked him even in Lackawanna Blues. But he's got an incredible resume, and the brother is just incredibly diverse. And so he's played some critical parts that I just didn't expect him to be in, and he rose to the character really well. So he's one of my favorite actors, Jeffrey Wright, and I'm glad he was in this. Film also stars newcomer Isaiah John, and he's been in a couple pieces like Snowfall. Really, he still looks like he's a little new to the game, but he was in Barbershop: The Next Cut. So he's been out there. He's been an insurgent, but he plays a very interesting piece as the best friend of the main protagonist. And then you have here Black Manta himself, when Yahya Abdul Mateen, right? And you've seen him as both Black Manta and Aquaman. He's been in the Get Down. He's been in a number of pieces. He's supposed to be in the Matrix 4, which is interesting. I look forward to that. Candyman, which I don't think has officially come out, but it's set for this year. So we'll see how the virus has impacted that. And a number of other things. He's been in Watchmen, and he starred as, spoilers again, as Dr. Manhattan, taking on a black form. Interestingly enough, he starred in Us. So he's been in a number of things, and I like this brother's career and where he's going. And in this, he plays the big kingfish gangster as far as the film is concerned. So again, it's set in Oakland, and he plays. So you have a young brother who's trying to figure out his path, and the film basically starts with him killing a local drug dealer named Malcolm, which is interesting. Now, this primary character's name is Ja, right? His character's name is Ja, and it's actually short for Jakur, right? And Jakur is basically his name is Jakur Abraham Lincoln. So they call him Ja, but as we know in the Rastafarian tradition, Ja is short for God, Jehovah, and Abraham Lincoln is, credited as the president that freed the slave. So it could be read as, the God who frees the slave in a particular symbolic way. But the course of this film, he's really trying to free himself. And I think a lot of that is what's happening. So Ja starts the film by killing a drug dealer named Malcolm, and he actually kills Malcolm's girlfriend along with him and leaves the daughter alive. And of course, he is ID'd and quickly brought in, right? And so as he's brought in court, the mother of the daughter who was killed cusses him out basically, and she can't understand why he was born and so on and so forth. So the film is narrated by him, and it kind of chronicles his life, and it jumps back and forth. So what you have is he is the son of Jeffrey Wright's character, right? And Jeffrey Wright's character is named James Daniel Lincoln, or JD. JD is he's a gangster. He's trying to take care of his family on the street, and he's struggling to do it. And the pressure of doing so has brought him to a point where he started to become an addict himself. And he's fraying from the stress of all of that. And they show you some scenes on how he deals with Ja as a young man. So Ja, at a particular point as a boy, gets bullied, gets something taken away from him, and which is very normal in African-American culture. JD persists to pressure Ja to go handle that situation, go deal with it. And Ja goes back to school, picks up a rock, busts the bully in the head, and gets back his thing. He gets kicked out of school, to which his mother is frustrated, but JD is actually pleased by, right? And this reflects really what black men, are really try to impart to their sons. And I think JD is a representation of that. Even if it's not societally welcomed or accepted, it's the idea that you're not going to let just anybody take something from you. You know what I mean? You're going to stand up for yourself, even at the potential loss of status or punishment by the society. And JD is kind of pleased with that dynamic, to see that his young man it can really confront his own fear. And that's really what, even if you have a functional society where you have a rite of passages for young boys, rite of passage, one of the key elements to that rite of passage is overcoming fear, especially for boys. So a lot of confronting bullies and whatnot is about overcoming fear. And that's what a lot of that is. So JD imparts that to him, but he does it in a way that's very street, and, it kind of contributes to the environment the way it is. So it's not something his mother's happy about, but it does say, it does kind of prepare him for the environment he's in, which is what JD is ultimately trying to do. But the pressure of being a provider, taking care of his family in the midst of a hood, begins to crack on JD, and he starts to fray at the edges. You know what I mean? But at that point, just before Ja goes in to kill Malcolm, you actually see Malcolm talking to his girl. So Malcolm has become one of the major threats to the primary drug dealer of the area, whose name is Stunner, and Big Stunner, and that's who Yahya plays. And so Malcolm is his rival, and Yahya ultimately wants him dead. But in order to achieve that, he has to get close to him. So at a particular point in the film, Ja volunteers for that job. Now, Ja has been trying to stay kind of out of the mix, right? He has a girlfriend. He has a couple ladies he's seeing, but there's a girlfriend in particular that he's with named Shantae, played by Shakira Janae Pay, I think her name is. And so, he gets her pregnant and immediately begins to think about how he can do things differently from JD, how he can raise his son, what he can do. And he goes and gets a regular job, like at a shoe store, where he has this very early and upon getting hired. And it's actually very difficult for him to find a job because he doesn't have anything prior to that really makes him a good candidate. He's done some jail time. So it makes it difficult. And it kind of shows you the difficulties young men have getting jobs when they haven't been properly prepared for that. But he gets a job at a shoe store when on his first day, is an older white woman that comes in and basically, thinks he's, kind of stealing as opposed to actually being an employee there. And Ja, being as quiet and meditative as he is, he doesn't say very much. And the situation just kind of doesn't go well. So Ja is dealing with the frustrations of being in an environment he doesn't want to be in, but he's doing all he can to, actually support his son. And eventually he gives in and decides to work for Stunner as kind of a hired hand, a thug, and so he's trying to find a way to make some money and kind of go through it that route, even though his best friend, who is played by Isaiah John, his best friend TQ, is in the life. He works for Stunner. He wants to be a drug dealer. And so he and Ja are connected. Actually, there's three of them technically. And it's where'd he go? I think it's Lamarck. Yeah. So it's TQ, Lamarck, and Ja are best friends since elementary school. Lamarck is kind of a square. He doesn't want to get into the life at all. He ends up going to the military, but he gets injured, comes home, and it has a series of health problems. So in his attempt to avoid the life, he ends up, kind of getting in a situation where he's extremely hurt physically based on his injury, and his health declines throughout the course of the film. So you really have this kind of situation where Black men are limited by their environment in a variety of ways. So, now Ja also wants to be a rapper. So you have that angle to it too, right? Where he's putting up videos on YouTube. So you have the traditional angles that, the average everyday young Black male faces as life options: music and entertainment, going into the drug life, going into the military, finding or juggling low-paying jobs. These are the primary areas that many young Black men find themselves trying to navigate. And sure enough, they go through all of them. And what you end up seeing is Lamarck ends up dying from his injuries, which says something about what the value of military service to brothers in the hood who are trying to find a way out. They can lose their lives behind something that doesn't really relate to their day-to-day existence, going to another country, fighting in a war, and then ending up injured and ending up back in the hood you left, right? Then you have the life, and TQ is deep in the life, but the life is filled with a lot of contradictions, a lot of backbiting, a lot of under the table kind of behavior. So there's really no one you can trust, even your best friend. And you'll see, a moment where in prison, TQ and Ja end up having to go against one another because it's revealed that TQ secretly works for Malcolm, trying to, oust Big Stunner as the major big fish drug dealer in Oakland. So he's secretly working for Malcolm, trying to undo Stunner, and Ja kind of gets in the middle of it. And then you have Ja trying to navigate this life while becoming a new father and navigating all of that. And there's a moment where he finds out that his baby's mother, soon-to-be baby's mother, has had sex with somebody else prior to meeting Ja, but it's on camera. So Ja's embarrassed by that, and he goes over and breaks up with her. And so you have all of these moments that reveal something about Ja's inability to navigate in a mature way different types of situations. He responds with emotion. He responds with anger. And those are usually the traits of young men who haven't really been fathered well, and even though JD wants to make sure he has some degree of courage to him, JD's locked up at a particular point, and he's out of Ja's life permanently. right? Because he murdered somebody and Ja actually witnessed it. So he gets locked up while Ja is fairly young, and Ja has to navigate and find his own sense of manhood by himself, drawing from the elements in the area, right? So you have that angle of it. And so this is the plight of many young black men trying to find their way. Right. This is what we're dealing with. There's a moment where you get to see a variety of moments where you see black men and women interacting. Malcolm in particular talking to his girl just before he gets killed. And he actually says as they're walking up the stairs, he checks her about her trying to check his speech and how he talks. And he's like, "Don't ever do that," So you get to see on a class level how different kinds of men respond to being silenced or being checked by their women. So it's an interesting little brief moment. But there's another where there's a particular point where the woman in court whose daughter Ja killed screams, "I hope you rot in hell." And they're kind of doing a montage of different mugshots of black men. So it's an interesting, I think it was a montage of Ja getting his mugshot. And there's an interesting kind of statement because you hear this, "I hope you rot in hell," coming from a black woman, right? And so there's something to be said there about the tensions between black men and women in regard to that, because they don't reveal why Ja has killed Malcolm till the very end, right? But there's some interesting things even in the narration where Ja kind of explains some things really well, or gives some things to consider that I think you'll be able to jump into and use as talking points with your child. And I have no problem stopping movies and checking to see if they understand what happened, asking questions, and then giving advice about how it may apply in their real lives. So consider doing that. Let's see. There's a particular point in the narration, right, where after Ja goes to jail, he says, "I see where all the missing fathers went." Teenagers arrested for weed or OGs at this point. Basically they were warehousing black men, and he got to see where they all went to. So it was a kind of moment where seeing that and hearing Ja's voice kind of lets you know that the experience a lot of young black men had, including Ja himself, it wasn't that the men just disappeared. Many of them went to prison. And so you can see that visually. And I think it had an important kind of tone to it. But they even say by the time, he was 6 years old, Ja was 6, his father, JD, had been in jail 9 times. So by this point, he's in for life, and Ja never sees him until he goes to jail himself. JD actually does whoop him for losing his toy to a bully, which inspires him to go back and get it back, or at least stand up for himself. So that's important. But it also speaks to the rage that one generation of men pass down to another. And that's a rage at the system. It's a rage at the circumstances they find themselves in. And then, too, it can be difficult, particularly for a father, to look at a son in a particular environment and know the limitations he's going to face, and to see that much potential freedom and happiness in a little boy, to know what the loss of all of that innocence is going to mean, can be frustrating in and of itself, and it can end up being built up rage that further gets kind of thrown onto the family in a particular way. So that's important to kind of look at. There's a particular point where he says, "The judge told me this was the end of my freedom, but I can't remember ever feeling free." So as he's in court for having killed Malcolm and his girl, he's talking about having been imprisoned in his own way, just being in Oakland, just living in poverty. All right. And he talks about slavery taught black people to survive, but not how to live. And that's what we pass on to each other. So he's talking about that dysfunction. He's talking about that rage of being cooped up economically, being stuck in environments with few options, and then, kind of the inevitable route for a good percentage of black men. I believe it's 1 in 4 at this point, 1 in 3 actually, that end up in prison in some way, shape, or form. So that the type of imprisonment of knowing with few options available to you where you're likely to end up unless there's an intervention, the feeling of being trapped, the feeling of not being free, all of that, ends up kind of being brought out in these narratives. And when he goes to jail, he's there with his father, because that's who's waiting for him. That's who's already locked up for life. So the film kind of gives you a sense of the impending inevitability of prison for many black men, in the fact that he goes to prison and sees his father there, right? So they kind of symbolically connect Jah with Jesus at about 21 minutes, 39 seconds. There's a point where, he's being frisked by a guard in the prison and he has to outstretch his hands, and then they cut to a church. So the symbolism of Jah, Abraham Lincoln, his full name, right? The God who rescues or liberates the slave. And that could speak to his inner self, the inner slave that he's felt like for a great deal of time. We see the connection with Jesus symbolically at that moment. So that's, part of that. He says at a particular point, it's crazy when you have nothing to give. That's when you want to give everything. And this is the point where he finds out that his girl is pregnant. He wants to give everything to his son, but knows he has nothing to offer, nothing to give. Right. Let's see. There's a particular argument that takes place between JD and Jah's mother. And I think that might be Tametta, played by Regina Taylor, as his mother. And so there's an argument JD and Tamela have where she says, I got to be the mommy and the daddy up in here. A real fucking man would take care of his family. And this is the point where I think Jeffrey Wright's character, JD, chokes her and pushes her up against the wall. He's talking in her face, but that's the tension. A lot of divorces are caused by money, lack of resources, lack of employment, which is something Black women tend to have more readily than Black men. Even though they earn less than white women for the same job, they tend to be more readily employed than Black men. So when you're in an environment in a poor city where you have Black men with no education and few opportunities who end up having to do, engage in illegal acts to find, some degree of income, it's usually not as secure and stable as what, Black women tend to find. And so the tension between the two can definitely build and cause stress. And that stress usually manifests physically. And as we know, intimate partner violence in the Black community is bidirectional. So that violence can go either way and tends to do so on a fairly equal basis. Right. But it's nonetheless the framing of their argument. But at the end of the day, JD really does want what's best for his son. But he gives it, he gives what he can in a dysfunctional manner because that's the environment he's in. This is not a dysfunctional that is tied to the DNA. This is a dysfunction that's tied to, the environment, the rules of that environment, the options available to you. And there's another point where Josh says, loyalty is currency. It's your name, your credit line at the liquor store, your hall pass when you out of pocket. It's that thing you worry about most when niggas be taking trips on motherfuckers daily. That's an important line, right? Because respect is key, loyalty is key in every environment, but most particularly in an environment where you can lose your life over it very quickly. Like loyalty is currency. People are always trying to secure more of it because they don't know who they can trust. And most of the time you can't trust anybody in circumstances like that. So your reputation becomes incredibly important, right? And part of the film actually deals with the question of Black love because Jah actually does love his girlfriend, which is interesting. Shantae, I think it is. He actually does love her, but the question of, can love thrive in this kind of environment is pervasive throughout the film. In and out of prison, police chasing Black men down, competition with other Black men for women, illegal activity, and the kind of environment that can produce where people are killing each other over whatever they can get, depending on, the environment you're in. All of those kind of things contribute to the question itself: can love thrive in an environment like that? And so you see with Jah and his girl, this whole question of can it work? And for them, it has to work in the midst of imprisonment because Jah has volunteered to Stunner to kill Malcolm, the other rival drug dealer. And he has his motivations for doing so, which aren't revealed until the end. And basically what it is that Malcolm was the one that sold drugs to JD, sold drugs to Jah's father, and got him hooked. And eventually, when JD killed somebody and went to prison, a lot of that was tied to his drug use, which Jah, attributed to Malcolm's dealing. So when he volunteered to kill Malcolm, there was an underlying motive, which was to get back at him for what he did to his father. So you're talking about generational revenge, generational resentment, generational frustration passed on in an environment where poor people are locked up together. So, it might be important to pull out at that moment, how environment kind of influences relationships, and how it can carry on grudges over generations. Um, there's a particular point where I think it's JD who says, "You and me ain't no good for kids." He then describes how mothers and grandmothers hold things together for the kids. But one of the things we find is that nobody really talks about the role of fathers and the sacrifice of fathers, even JD, the sacrifice of fathers for their family in the Black community. you know so and the degree to which, even in their absence, sometimes the Black men are sacrificing for their kids if their absence can bring about security, stability, and safety. So like in the 1970s, if you look at the onset, it wasn't the beginning, of course, but another wave of welfare. There was an argument made, or when we talk about the man in the house rule, where you couldn't get welfare support unless the man was absent. I had a student in my class some years ago who told me she remembered her mother and father planning that. Right, her father, they agreed that he should leave the home so they could get access to welfare, they can get access to housing, and he would come visit from time to time, but it was a purposeful separation. And I believe that happened to a great number of Black families, because that allowed the family to have a degree of security. Even in this situation with JD being a kind of a gangster in and of himself, sometimes people like that will be absent so that revenge, killings, and so on don't necessarily come back to the family. So the sacrifices of fathers is something that's kind of overlooked in many different discussions about the Black community, particularly the poorest aspects of it, and the degrees to which fathers sacrifice in a variety of ways to care for their family, and that's usually not brought up. So we tend to focus on the mothers and grandmothers because they have the more visible sacrifices. They're present in a particular way, even if the fathers, especially if the fathers are in prison, right? But that still says something, because sometimes the fathers have gone to prison in an attempt to do something for their families. So when JD says to Ja in prison, "You and me ain't no good for kids," it's a kind of jarring moment in and of itself. It really gets at the heart of how we look at the roles of Black fathers and Black mothers, and what we overlook and what we don't. Let me see. Let's see. Ja, in and of himself, he has problems being direct at different times. He doesn't articulate himself well. He tends to stay quiet, and he responds, with anger a lot, and doesn't really control his temper. So there's a scene where he's released from jail by his mother and her new boyfriend, and by the time they get to the car, he gets into a fight with the boyfriend. Now, the boyfriend was being an ass. There's no question about that. But instead of articulating himself, Ja really just picks up a rock and starts smashing the car and gets in a fight. So there's, the capacity to articulate how he feels, what's going on in his head. Sometimes you can mitigate a lot of that violence with communication, and Ja has not developed the skills to do that. Nobody's really passed that on. JD didn't have the skills to do it. And really, even Ja's mother didn't have the skills to do it. So the skill of being able to articulate yourself as a way of releasing, as opposed to releasing with reaction, emotion, and violence, those things kind of complicate Ja's life that much more, right? So he kind of ends up kind of parting from his mother, at least until she comes to visit him when he is in prison, and she's disgusted, with what he's done, so on and so forth. So his problems with being direct and articulating himself are key. Drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms and escape gestures. This is real. We find this whenever there's economic tension. You find attempts to escape through entertainment, through drugs, through alcohol, coping mechanisms, and they usually end up contributing negatively to the situation. But folks don't often feel they have any other options, and that plays a role here in JD's drug use. You can see the kind of impact of that, right? The father describes the trap of not having food stamps or Section 8 housing for Black men. So income implies the same illegal enterprises that are used to further entrap Black men are what Black men have to turn to in order to survive. So so in that essence, you have a way where the environment works against you. Let me see. You can also say, craziness becomes a currency in and of itself. um, and murder as a way of releasing pent up tension and rage. So Ja is actually hired by Stunner to be a hired hand, to be a thug, because he's willing to do it. So there is currency in being willing to do it. Um, let's see. Mm, you have this moment where the three friends, Ja, TQ, and Lamarck, they're each competing. And I'm saying this is in the writing, not necessarily the characters themselves. They're each competing with one another for options and what are the best options to deal with the environment they're in. And, all three of them ultimately fail, right? Lamarck dies from his injuries. TQ ends up in jail and ends up fighting with Ja, and Ja ends up killing him, or at least that's what we seem to see. And Ja himself ends up in jail for life. So the film is kind of saying for many black men, no matter the options they kind of take on, it usually, it doesn't end up well, particularly for black men in Oakland who are navigating the hood, right? And so, a couple lessons I pulled from this. Lesson one: environment can chronicle how a murderer is made, right? If you look at the kind of environment people are in, you can actually see the kind of, the kind of murderer that can be created by that environment. And murder in and of itself can be anything from a business transaction to a release or to revenge, right? There's so many motivations for murder, especially in an environment where people are locked up together with no options, and that can be raise the tension. So you can kind of chronicle how murderers are made in different environments based on the pressures of those environments. Lesson number two, this is something you can impart to your sons, most especially: keep your plans to yourself. And this is one thing, even though I think the actor Ashton Sanders is a little too quiet in many of his roles, I think the way it played out with Ja at key moments was very useful. Ja was very quiet. And when Ja would have a thought and begin to make a plan, he wouldn't tell anybody about it, which I think tends to be a good way to go when you're in a particular environment, keeping your plans to yourself, being quiet, never really telling everybody everything you're planning. There's value in silence, right? Lesson number three: never close yourself off too much from those who truly love you. There are moments where Ja has to learn how to accept the love, but ultimately he doesn't think he's worth it. And I think many black men get trapped into that notion too, that they're not worth the love that they really need. And because of that, they don't accept it, they don't allow it for themselves, and they close themselves off from even the people they need. So you kind of see him reconciling with that close to the end of the film, with his mother, with his baby's mother, and with his baby, and of course even with his father in prison. And he actually starts growing things in the garden that they have there, and teaching his father how to do it. So actually, building relationships with the people he loves. Lesson four: address problems and people directly. Don't carry your frustrations out on those who don't. Hold on. Oh, I don't have it up on the screen for you. Here you go. There we go. Address people and problems directly. Don't carry your frustrations out on those who don't deserve it. So basically, here, this is something that Ja needs to learn in terms of being direct and articulating his issues, and not just holding things in, not resolving them, and then carrying his frustrations out on the people around him that don't deserve it. There's an importance to managing emotions and managing pain for men, especially considering the social pressure for men to not express them, right? I constantly hear this narrative that men are incapable of expressing emotions, or on the other side of the spectrum, when they do express it, they're socially punished for doing so. They're somehow weak because they have them. Both extremes aren't true. But to be able to get to a point where you can maturely navigate the expression of emotions without necessarily doing so in a manner that doesn't generate respect from others. You can navigate emotional expression in a masculine manner that gives you kind of investment for others in a particular way, and that's not something that Ja has been privy to, because much of that comes about from dealing with men. You can see other kinds of men that find different ways. One of the interesting things about Stunner, is that he cooks. He enjoys cooking as a form of expression. He is wild and he will kill somebody who's standing next to him if he feels the need to, but he's not overly emotional. He's fairly strategic about why he does what he does, even if you don't know what his strategy is. But him actually finding alternative means of expressing himself, like through food, culinary arts, is interesting, and it says something about men. So their values you may not agree with, but the way they can actually become mature in their expression of emotion in terms of what they choose to do can be extremely interesting. And this is something that I think the film kind of lightly touches on. Lesson number 5, control your anger, right? Again, we're back to emotion. This is one of the biggest facets of, transitioning from boyhood into manhood, and mostly any community you find in the world. Control of emotion. In particular, the two emotions that have to be focused upon the most are fear and anger, right? And one can cause the other. Right? Fear can cause anger. Fear can cause insecurity. Fear can cause rage. Fear can be the impetus behind all kind of different behaviors. So if men, young men in particular, boys in particular, who are approaching teen years, if they're not put in a process where it's explained and they're walked through how to control fear and how to control anger, it can become an explosive thing in the community in and of itself. So, really impressing upon boys the value of controlling their emotions is very key. How to navigate emotions even in the moment of high emotion, thinking logically through problems while you're engaging it. It doesn't mean you have to be a robot, doesn't mean you don't have to feel anything at all. That's not the goal. The goal is just to feel, but not allow your feelings to control your behavior. The goal is to be able to feel what you're going through, but still make decisions based on rational conclusions. Because for boys, black boys in particular, there are very few second chances. There are very few second opportunities. So, because you walk in the door with no second or third opportunities, you can't afford to often mess up the one opportunity you have. So you don't have the luxury of not controlling your emotions, which leads us to number 6, thinking strategically. And 6 and 7 are actually tied together. Thinking strategically, as you navigate the environment, navigate the world, right? Instead of responding from one situation to another out of emotion, thinking strategically through where it is you want to get to and how to get there, which is actually lesson 7. Choose an end goal, then make a plan to get there and carry it out strategically. So what do you want to do? What do you want to be? Talking with your children through, your boys in particular, about what the end goal is, and actually expanding what options they know to think about. Because much of the stereotypes that pertain to black boys is all they want to do is be rappers, play video games, play sports. These kind of limited options. You have to expand what they become familiar with, so they know there's a wider set of options. And then once you can kind of navigate into a certain area, now we can think strategically on how to get to those areas. So choosing an end goal and making a plan to get there is an important step in that process. Prioritizing what's important, right? If you have an end goal and you know what the strategic steps are to get to that end goal, then you can more easily determine if any given action is consistent with that goal. So, is holding something that some illegal material that you shouldn't be holding. If that's not consistent with the goal, then you know that you shouldn't do it. Going somewhere might be a problem. All of these kind of things allow you, if you have a clear cut end goal and you've mapped out some steps to get to that. So if you want to be a chef, or if you might want to be a psychologist, well, you're going to have to go to school for that, right? And that in order to go to school for that, you might have to do things in K through 12 to prepare yourself and make yourself as competitive as possible. So if you can walk your child through those steps, even if that end goal changes, which is to be expected, at least if they're on a path, then when they are doing something that's potentially dangerous in regard to that end goal, you can actually help them, because the goal is to get them to think this way on their own without your presence, right? But if you can help them to think logically through the steps, okay, how is what I'm about to do contribute to my goal? Does it upend the steps that I want to take? And so that becomes a very important part of manhood, to be able to strategically think through steps, but prioritize what is consistent and what helps us get to the end goal, as opposed to just doing things and responding emotionally. Uh, Lesson number 8: know your environment. Right? If you understand what the limitations of your environment are and what are the kinds of traps you see people fall into, you want to know your environment well enough to know what to stay out of, how to navigate around certain things, and how to do well. And I would say, tied to knowing your environment, actually finding mentors. This is something that in your teen years is good to start doing, is to develop mentors, whether that's playing on an athletic team or something else. It could be anything. It could be chess, it could be a debate team, but putting yourself in situations where you actually begin to develop relationships with mentors, I think is key. And it helps you to better understand your environment as well as navigate it. And then lastly, know your enemies, but know yourself better. Understand your limitations and proclivities. If you can understand how your enemies think about you and what they plan, how they function, you can better understand what kinds of things they're capable of, especially in regard to you. But if you also know your own limitations, though, your own, the things that you're drawn to, whatever that may be, it could be relationships, it could be pleasure, it could be games, it could be whatever your proclivities are. If we can motivate our children to have a better understanding of their own limitations and the things that they're drawn to, an understanding of those things, as well as an understanding of their enemies and the kinds of people that work against them, they can better navigate their environments to get to that end goal we talked about in lesson 7. So just a few thoughts on what you can bring to the film and dialoguing with your sons. But it is a very powerful and a very sad film in a particular way, much in the line of Boys in the Hood. But it does speak to the environment many of us are living in. So hope that helps, and be on the lookout for my next film review. Peace.